where he served as a communications officer and also as an infantry officer. And many of you have probably taken classes from Fred before. He has a broad range of specialties in history, including the Civil War, African history, but he also, frankly, is a man for all seasons, because as we were looking to identify someone to teach a course on Korea, we were having considerable difficulty. And as usual, Dr. Fred Johnson stepped up. So we really appreciate that. And so without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Fred Johnson.
Good morning, scholars of HASP.
Good morning. Don't you love how he says that? I love that.
True enough, it was out of an interest in Korea, but more out of an interest to finally talk to some people who are actually interested in what I have to say. The two Koreas, and Kim's going to show the video in just a moment, but the two Koreas mean that obviously North Korea, South Korea. And North Korea is that communist nation that's been dominated by a communist regime since 1946, since the end of World War II, installed by the Soviets, supported by the Chinese communists. And then, of course, the South Korean regime, which has been supported primarily, not primarily, but generally speaking, by the United States and the West. The situation with Korea has been forever very difficult. They called it the Hermit Kingdom. It's one of the most closed societies on earth. It's one of the most repressive governments on earth. And of course, back during the Cold War, what people call the workers' paradise, that's what it parrots to its people, and what had people believe around the world that is going on inside of North Korea. The truth is that there's anything other than paradise happening inside of North Korea. We'll get into that. So what's going to happen is that we'll play the video, which will give you the full treatment on both North and South Korea. But what I want to focus on are my comments relative to North Korea, how that has impacted the West, what it means historically, and what it means going forward. There are some things I think that I'm going to point out that the video does not pay attention to. So we're going to go and see the DVD now.
Yeah, right? I wish there was a
Did how many of you all heard that just a few moments ago, I found out that Secretary of State Colin Powell has passed away? We have lost a truly great American, a truly great American.
City, Seoul. In some ways as modern, as wicked as anything in the Western world. Korea today seems like a very distant relative to that once war-ravaged land.
It was a transformation so dramatic that it could only be described as a miracle. When the Korean War ended in 1953, South Korea was impoverished and stagnant. Today, it is the world's 12th largest economy, an incubator of cutting-edge technology, and a potent cultural force. Great Decisions investigates South Korea's rapid development and examines its evolving partnership with the United States. The Korean Peninsula, next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
When the Korean director Bong Joon-ho arrived at the Incheon airport, fresh off his dramatic victory at the Academy Awards, a jubilant crowd gathered to applaud a native son.
South Korean public went absolutely crazy. They were so euphoric. They see it as having achieved something very special.
Parasite's critical success was just one more reminder that Korean culture has become a global phenomenon.
The success of Korean cultural exports has really, I think, changed the way that people around the world think about Korea. And it's also made Korea a very desirable place.
Increasingly, as Korean culture gains salience and awareness here in the United States, there's a mutual respect. The Koreans are constantly true to their traditional values, but also mixing, matching, creating, and experimenting.
The ascendance of Korean culture seems all the more remarkable to those who fully appreciate just how far South Korea has come.
I remember it was an omnipresent sight. Beggars on the streets at dinner time, begging for food, carrying tin cans. For South Korea to have achieved the level of freedom and democracy and wealth over the past couple of generations, this truly is a singular feat.
To an American, the free soil of Korea is hallowed ground.
As South Koreans emerged from the devastation of the Korean War, the U.S. stepped in to jumpstart the Korean economy.
The U.S. and ROK entered into a formal alliance arrangement. So this gave South Korea the security space to develop its economy, to develop its domestic political system.
Directly after the Korean War, all the natural resources and industrial factories were located in the north, and South Korea had nothing to rely on but human resources. The aid funds extended by the United States played a crucial role in post-war reconstruction effort.
Steady streams of urgently needed supplies pour into Seoul and other Korean villages and cities. The tools and machines of industry, the fertilizer and equipment needed to restore the land to fertility.
The driving force behind South Korea's modernization was a controversial military dictator named Park Chung-hee. At the height of the Cold War, Park was eager to strengthen his country's bond with the U.S., even when doing so provoked anger at home.
South Korea was a key ally of the United States. The United States needed combat troops, and South Korea from 1965 to 1971 sent 300,000 combat troops to Vietnam.
Some 3,000 ROK troops debarked from their landing craft as reinforcements for Korean soldiery already active in the war. As the regiment continues to troop ashore, the Koreans fall into formation to march along the main street of Kwainon.
Opposition Korean politicians rightfully pointed out that South Korea would be akin to playing the role of mercenary in supporting the U.S. war campaign. And by 1971, you have about $1 billion flowing into the South Korean economy.
South Korea was also able to gain from normalizing relations with Japan, which was able to happen because Park Chung-hee was an authoritarian ruler, and it was a very unpopular decision.
Although Park relied on American support, he was determined to forge his own path when it came to modernizing South Korea's economy.
Park Chung-hee wanted to focus on the development of heavy industry in Korea, and the key heavy industry would be the steel industry. The World Bank thought it would be inefficient. Nevertheless, President Park persisted. He gambled, and that gamble paid off.
We tend to believe markets are always the most efficient. But the Korean government went against market forces. They picked winners. They didn't let competition decide which companies were going to survive.
Park built close partnerships with South Korea's largest companies, family-run conglomerates known as chaebols.
The term chaebol refers to large industrial conglomerates within the Korean economy. A chaebol is a business group where ownership and management are both concentrated within a single family.
Samsung, Hyundai, LG, and SK, those are the four big ones. What makes the chaebol unique from other companies around the world is their sprawl and their size. Most chaebol groups make pretty much everything they can.
The South Korean economic development model is one of the government playing a very aggressive role by subsidizing key strategic industries and colluding with big businesses.
The founder of Samsung, Lee Byung-chul, realized that he could actually build not just a business empire, but the entire nation of South Korea with it.
As South Korea blossomed into an economic powerhouse, American policymakers and business leaders grew frustrated with the protectionist policies that had fueled its development. In 2006, the two countries began the arduous process of negotiating a bilateral free trade agreement.
I was the chief U.S. negotiator for the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. I think there'll be a number of difficult issues, but I don't envision any deal breakers.
The goal was to open up our respective markets to each other and to integrate our two economies more closely. Before that time, the U.S. and Korea were basically adversaries. Korea wanted to sell its products all over the world, including to the U.S., while at the same time keeping its market closed.
Almost all free trade agreements are controversial because there's winners and there's losers. In Korea, farmers were deeply opposed to the free trade agreement that would allow in U.S. beef, U.S. rice, U.S. soybeans.
We are against the forcible agreement for free trade between South Korea and the United States, benefiting conglomerates, pro-U.S. officials, and men of influence.
In 2008, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, known by the acronym KORUS, became a flashpoint in American electoral politics.
During the campaign, President Obama was public about how he did not approve of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. And so when he took office, he instructed us to go back to the agreement and to renegotiate.
The agreement we're announcing today includes several important improvements and achieves what I believe trade deals must do. In particular, manufacturers of American cars and trucks will have much more access to the Korean market.
A divided Congress finally ratified the renegotiated KORUS agreement in 2011. The deal took effect the following year.
We now are the largest supplier of beef to Korea, and we're now the second largest supplier of pork. U.S. investment in South Korea increased by over 20%, and Korean investment here in the United States increased by over 60%. By any measurement, KORUS has been good for America and has been good for Korea too.
Once Korea completed the negotiations with us, our model became Korea's model. And so when it sat down with other countries around the world, it started to ask for similar things that we asked Korea to do. So in many ways, Korea became a great partner in helping to lift the standards of trade agreements around the world.
But the drama surrounding KORUS was far from over.
Once President Trump got into office, he started to walk back a number of U.S. trade agreements. He claimed the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement was harming American exports such as cars, so he wanted a renegotiation of this.
We have a very bad trade deal with Korea, very, very bad trade deal. It's a deal that, it's incompetent that somebody could have made a deal like that.
Some people were worried that it might cause tensions between the United States and Korea. However, despite these concerns, we approach the negotiations in good faith.
The takeaway for the South Koreans was that President Trump basically needed just enough for him to spin it as a win. South Koreans were pretty happy with the result of the second round of negotiation with President Trump, they didn't feel they gave away too much.
With the swift conclusion of the negotiations for the revision, uncertainty surrounding our free trade agreement has been eliminated. As a result, companies from both countries will now be able to do business under more stable conditions.
The Koreans made some concessions. I think those did make the deal a little bit better for U.S. companies. And I think the Koreans very much want to keep this trade deal intact. And I think U.S. companies want to keep this trade deal intact.
The reality is that the new chorus changed so little that it didn't need congressional approval. At the end of the day, we have an agreement that looks very similar to what it looked before, but we invested a lot of political capital.
Although American trade with South Korea has grown since Chorus, the U.S. is not its biggest trading partner. South Korea's economic reliance on China puts Seoul in a tenuous position.
China is South Korea's #1 trading partner. China-South Korea trade is more than South Korea, United States, South Korea, Japan trade combined. So while U.S. obviously is still very important to South Korea in terms of economy and trade, it's #2. It's not #1 anymore.
There has been a rise in uncertainty resulting from the U.S.-China trade dispute. The Korean economy survives by navigating the global supply chain. If Chinese exports are blocked from entering the United States market, this would inevitably have a negative effect on Korean export to China.
The South Koreans have a saying that they are the shrimp among whales. They find themselves in a pretty tough neighborhood. The Chinese economic relationship looms large in South Korea.
The rivalry between China and the United States has tested the ability of successive Korean governments to craft an independent foreign policy without antagonizing either Beijing or Washington.
The relationship between South Korea and China and South Korea and the United States really puts Seoul in a delicate balancing act. They have to be careful not to go too far to alienate either one of them.
The notion that the US and China can somehow engage in this zero-sum strategic competition without having any major impact on its allies in the region, like South Korea and Japan, is false. And that is why American policymakers really need to pay closer attention to what policymakers in Seoul and Tokyo are saying.
In recent years, the Chinese government has been quick to punish South Korea economically for any behavior it perceives as a threat.
We saw this dynamic with the decision by the United States to deploy THAAD, the Theater High Altitude Air Defense System. It's a missile defense system that President Obama and South Korean President Park decided to deploy in 2016. Now, this was a system that the Chinese objected to quite strenuously, and it put Korea in a very uncomfortable position.
Our missile defense cooperation, THAAD, is a purely defensive system to deter and defend against North Korean threats.
China did not hesitate to bare knuckle pressure South Korea. Suddenly, all the group tours of Chinese tourists to South Korea stopped. The very large department store firm found that suddenly no one was coming into its shops. Korean performers going to China for very lucrative tours suddenly couldn't get their visas.
Determined to check China's growing influence around the world, American national security officials from both parties view South Korea as a crucial base from which to pressure Beijing.
I think in responding to China overall in this century, the U.S. needs to do more to have structures in East Asia and South Asia that put military partnerships in a more effective posture.
As the United States pursues what is likely to be a long-term competition with China, our alliances, including Korea, are going to be a critical advantage.
But the military partnership between the U.S. and South Korea has become increasingly strained.
We're defending nations that are very wealthy. South Korea is a very wealthy nation. They make our television sets, they make ships, they make everything.
From the moment he took office, Donald Trump began pressuring South Korea to spend more to offset the cost of basing more than 28,000 American soldiers in the country.
Now they're paying $1 billion a year. And I went to him again. I said, look, I'll be back because that's just a fraction. And again, the relationship is great, but it's just not a fair relationship.
This is another aspect of the purely transactional Trump view of what the deployment of American forces around the world is about. I think that it is almost certainly true that other countries could spend substantially more on their own defense than they do. The problem is, in the Trump view, if they're not paying enough, we'll just come home. I think that's a big mistake.
President Trump views the United States as a mercenary power. He wants to deploy our troops to places only where those nations will pay. Well, that's not why we send troops around the world. Our military is not a money-making operation for the federal government.
This is a very strong alliance we have, but Korea is a wealthy country and could and should pay more to help offset the cost of defense.
The South Koreans are not free riders, not even close. They are an unbelievably productive ally. The United States' largest overseas military base was recently completed, and that cost was around $10 billion, and the Koreans paid between 92% and 96% of those costs.
Within South Korea, President Trump's burden-sharing demands fanned the flames of popular resentment.
If you look at polling, there's only a very, very small minority, single digits of people who are sympathetic to U.S. demands to dramatically increase payments to the United States. The vast majority, over 90% of Koreans, are opposed to a vast increase.
Our country really doesn't need you, Trump. Go back to your country quickly.
And the Koreans feel like they've kind of been given a shakedown, and they don't like it. They feel insulted. I think has undercut confidence in the relationship.
Some experts worry that American policymakers are reluctant even to debate the received wisdom that the U.S. must maintain a permanent military presence in East Asia.
That's premised on a particular view of what America should do, which is it should have a ring of forward deployed bases around the world. You could easily make an argument that the U.S. doesn't need any of these bases. But in Washington, D.C., the idea that the United States needs these bases is unquestioned.
What has been missing in Washington is a robust debate. And I think in the case of South Korea, some people have a knee-jerk reaction against even talking about it. They think it's very subversive or dangerous to suggest that U.S. troops should come home from South Korea 70 years after the Korean War.
America is a Pacific power, a resident Pacific power. And we are going nowhere. Nowhere.
We need to have a presence in the Korean Peninsula because if North Korea were to overrun South Korea, that would be a disaster for our own interests, both in that region and all across the world.
We just have that Cold War mentality that says we have to have forward bases. But the reality is our ability to project power from the United States around the globe is really substantial. I've been stationed in Korea. I've fought in 4 different combat environments. My assessment is that we don't need to be there.
Today, analysts paint a picture of a complicated relationship.
The vast majority of the South Korean people remain pro-US. However, paradoxically, outside the Middle East, we see on occasion the highest level of anti-US sentiment and even virulent anti-US protests. Where? In South Korea.
The older generation is grateful, but the folks who don't remember the Korean War or who didn't grow up in poverty, they have a very different view of the United States. They know that the democratization effort was achieved not with the help of the United States, but despite United States backing South Korean authoritarian rule.
There's always going to be some lingering pockets of anti-Americanism especially when there's a negative incident involving U.S. troops. But it's only a small minority of South Koreans who feel this way. 85% of South Koreans believe that U.S. troops are necessary today.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
American policymakers who respond forcefully to North Korea's provocations must walk a fine line. Millions of South Koreans still dream that reunification might someday be possible.
Particularly with a president like Moon Jae-in in power, there really is a desire of saying, you know, we've waited long enough.
South Korean fans gathered en masse tonight outside the ice hockey arena in Pyeongchang to voice their support for the unified Korean women's ice hockey team, which will take to the ice tomorrow for the first time in Olympic competition.
Win or lose, the result doesn't matter. I hope they play their best with a unified mind, moving toward the reunification.
I think Washington's view is keep the pressure on until North Korea comes to the table or to stay in stasis. That's a tension that has been present in a number of administrations in both Seoul and Washington.
President Moon wants to do more to engage aggressively with the North, whereas the United States is a little more cautious. You're always going to have not a perfect alignment between the two allies, but I think that's perfectly natural.
Yet despite the uncertainties in the US-South Korea alliance, leaders in both countries understand that they have tied their nations' fates together.
We share important values like democracy and a market economy. We learn from each other and appreciate each other's contribution. We have a famous saying that a tree with deep root will have many fruits.
Koreans feel increasingly over the years that our shared values are genuine. They want American leadership. Doesn't mean that they think we're perfect. They know we're not. But absent an American voice, absent American values, they think the world is a much more dangerous place.
Nearly 7 decades have passed since South Korea emerged, battered but defiant, from the horrors of an all-consuming war. Since then, ordinary Koreans have continued to battle, to revolutionize their economy, to build a democracy, and to earn respect on the global stage. Now, as Koreans look to the future, they must grapple with vexing questions about how to navigate a dangerous world.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to
Work. Yeah.
And click on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you. Some of the things to take some notes as while the video was playing, some things to keep in mind with regard to all this these present issues. The United States and Americans in general don't have as much of an appreciation for the long arc of history and its impact on current events like other people do around the world. So much of what was talked about, or never lose sight of the fact that the things that are discussed in that video are also happening or issues against the backdrop of some lingering memories from World War II, particularly some animosity and hostility that rests against Japan, because Japan dominated Korea for much of the early part of the 20th century. And then by World War II, it didn't get much better. Particularly, there's still an issue with Korean comfort women. These were women who were subjected to sexual slavery throughout Asia, the Philippines, China in particular, Korea, and that generation of women that went through that are dying out, but there's still some hope for restitution there. Another issue too, they mentioned the ROK Marines or the ROK soldiers. I was told by elders in the Marine Corps that the Marines from the Republic of Korea were some real tough, hard fighters. We came up against them that if Americans had to go fight anybody around the world, they would be the last people that you want to fight against, the Republic of Korean Marines. So they really are good at what they do. Another thing, the comment about the US being the #2 trade partner with South Korea, many people have been talking about this issue of this, could the 21st century be another American century? That information, that piece of information right there points to the fact that we're gonna have to struggle for it to be another American century, if in fact it's possible at all. They didn't mention the geographic area known as Australasia, which includes Australia, East Asia, but also Indonesia, Micronesia, and maybe even Vietnam. You'll know, some of you will probably be aware of the fact that in recent years, starting with the Obama administration, but particularly with the Obama administration, that there's been a concerted move to start directing American attention away from the Middle East and more toward East Asia, South Asia, and Australasia, because of all the things that the video pointed out, but also because of the growing concerns about China. Speaking of that, this means that if in fact there is that kind of economic competition that is not just dawning, but existing right now, it points to the heightened elevation of the importance of Vietnam, just in case you don't have enough irony in your life. A brief historical overview. During the Cold War, how we get to where we are, starting in 1949, we need to remember that in 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic device, ending the nuclear monopoly that the United States had from 1945, with dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Also in that same year, Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese, was pushed off of mainland China by the communist Chinese led by Mao Zedong onto the island called Formosa, or Taiwan as it's called today. Now I mention this because obviously China shares a border with North Korea, but also because during the Korean War, both China and the Soviet Union were backers of the North Korean regime. Mao Zedong, during that period, was the master of China. We need to also remember that during that time period, how we get to where we are, during the 1950s, particularly, there was a mindset among American policymakers, but also among NATO policymakers of this thing called the Domino Theory, that to allow one country to fall under the domination of communism would produce a shockwave effect, where if North Korea had already fallen, and then China that had already been taken over by the communists, if you allow South Korea to be taken over by the communists, then they'll go to Vietnam, then they'll go to Laos, then they'll go to Cambodia, then they'll go to India and Thailand and so on and so on. This was the mindset then. In 1950, June 25th, 1950 to be sure, to be specific, the North Korean army invaded South Korea, setting off an international crisis across the 38th parallel. And I decided not to take time to explain how the 38th parallel came to be the line that was drawn to separate North and South Korea, but it was a very haphazardly done kind of affair. I mean, not because of some conference where there were long, lengthy, detailed, complex negotiations. It was basically an evening where a couple of American policymakers, low-level policymakers, got a map and drew a line and said this would be the dividing line, because they were trying to figure out the best way to end World War II in the Pacific, and particularly to find a quick way of containing the Russians. President Truman was given the authority to order US Air and Navy units to fight in South Korea. But again, the South Korean regime was backed by the Soviet Union and also by the Chinese regime as well. The other thing to keep in mind is that when China was backing North Korea, The reason why Mao Zedong was backing North Korea and why China continues to use South Korea North Korea today is because North Korea has proven to be very, very, very useful to China as a buffer against the South and therefore as a buffer against the United States. So North Korea serves several purposes. One, to counterbalance the weight of the United States in the area, but also to expand Chinese foreign policy to allow to do other things around the world. At the time, because he had just taken over mainland China, Mao Zedong was more interested in consolidating power in China and therefore could not allow South Korean and especially South Korean forces backed by the United States to get close to his country, the Yalu River. So China's been a definite presence there. And this map shows exactly, not exactly, but a general movement of South Korean forces across the 38th parallel. UN and American forces were pushed down into this area called the Pusan Perimeter. President Truman ordered General Douglas MacArthur, who was serving as the military governor in Japan at the time, to stage a counterattack. General MacArthur chose to land at a place called Incheon. Incheon was the absolute worst possible choice you can make. The tidal movements were unpredictable. The port facilities were deficient at best. You could not plan anything. Plus in the military, this phrase called being channelized, they were guaranteed to be sitting ducks on the approach to the beach. Everything that said landed in Incheon said it was a terrible, terrible location. MacArthur's advisors strenuously advised him to not do it and gave him all these reasons. And he told them that's the exact reason why we're going to do it, because they know the same thing. They'll never see us coming. And as it turned out, they landed at Incheon and cut off the North Korean advance and basically initiated a scramble back toward the 38th parallel, the line separating North and South Korea, setting up the beachhead, so it was successful. Now, what should have happened, what could have happened, was that the Americans, having cut off the North Korean advance and caused a full-scale retreat, or as they say in the Marine Corps, advancing to the rear, people in this country began predicting that perhaps maybe the war would end by the end of 1950. But as American forces pushed further and further north, the situation began to change. This is just a picture of First Lieutenant Vladimir Lopez. He was one of the lead elements. He's the guy climbing up that ladder on the day of the assault. First Lieutenant Vladimir Lopez, United States Marine Corps, leading the 3rd Platoon Company A, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines over the seawall on the northern side of the Red Beach. I wanted you all to see this because this is not your typical beach landing. You can see the obvious difficulty with men dressed in full combat gear having to climb a ladder to get onto the beach. This is one of the things that they warned MacArthur against, and again, one of the reasons why he chose to land here. Lieutenant Vladimir Lopez was killed moments later when he was shot by a machine gun. He was about to throw a grenade into a bunker. The grenade fell on his hand. He dived onto it to shield his men from the blast. And he earned the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously. General MacArthur directed the landing. It was successful. And the fighting did return above back above the 38th parallel. But as they got closer and closer to the Yalu River, that contiguous border shared with China, Chinese officials were sending the Americans word through Indian diplomats, through back channels. Long before email, long before texting, they were carrying back channel pouches, telling the Americans at the State Department that if you get too close to the Yalu River, the Chinese government will come in on the side of the North Koreans. Again, they could not allow America to get that close because Mao Zedong still had to clean up what was going on inside of China after the communist takeover. They came in on the side of the North Koreans, and the war bogged down to this stalemate that lasted for another 2 or 3 years. And the line that you see right there, where North and South Korean and American-backed forces are along the 38th parallel, that's where they've been ever since 1953. They have a ceasefire, and a ceasefire means exactly what it says. It is a situation where the two combating parties or the two combatants have agreed to not shoot at each other. Now, I can tell you from talking to Marines who have been stationed along the 38th parallel, there are shots being fired along the 38th parallel all the time. More than that, the North Koreans are constantly probing by digging tunnels. I don't mean like tunnels that human beings can walk through. I'm talking about tunnels that tractor trailers can drive through. They're constantly probing, constantly looking for weaknesses along that area So they're very active about their business. So we pointed out that there was an armistice signed. I think it would be worthwhile to take at least a look, give some consideration to the people that have led North Korea. The DVD spent most of the time talking about South Korea, and that's wonderful. But there are, and like the title of this session says, two Koreas. The first leader was Kim Il-sung, who spent time in the Soviet army during World War II, actually became one of its leaders, which was pretty unusual because the Russians, not unlike anybody else, were very, very leery of having somebody not looking like them lead some of their forces. Kim Il-sung proved to be such a capable soldier, though, that he won that leadership. Second leader of North Korea was Kim Il-sung's son, Kim Jong-il. This is the two of them in 1992. I'll leave it to you all to figure out what's going on with their haircuts. This, I found, is an interesting family tree to show the progression of the leadership of the North Korean regime since 1946. Now, we need to keep in mind, 1946. So from 1946 to now, there have been three people that have led North Korea, all in the same family. It is essentially now the third leader, Kim Jong-un, who's been in charge of the country from December 2011 to present. Some concerns about North Korea. The first, I think, is that we've got this tyranny, this dictatorship, which is the family business. Now, let me draw an analogy here about the dangers of this kind of thing. In 2011, the same year that Kim Jong-un comes to power, something else happened on another part of the world called the Arab Spring. There was an individual that set himself on fire in Tunisia, and just like the monk that set himself on fire in Vietnam, it was a terrible, tragic thing that happened, but it was just involving one person. Nobody could have predicted that the events that followed thereafter would have such a cascade and produce such instability in that part of the world. This vendor, this merchant sets himself on fire because he's tired of the dictatorial rule in Tunisia. And then what begins to happen is that the people in Tunisia began clamoring for democracy. They want change. Now, people in the West and in America began saying, wow, what a great thing. People in the Middle East are finally wanting to get rid of their strongman rulers or autocrats, and it's democracy from the ground up, just like the way we say we like to see it, not from the top down. That feeling of wanting to get rid of strongman dictators migrated west or east over to Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi was in charge. Then it migrated to Egypt, where Hosni Mubarak was in charge. Then it migrated further east to Syria, where Bashar al-Assad was in charge. Bashar al-Assad is the son of Hafiz al-Assad. In the 1980s, when people tried to revolt against Hafiz al-Assad, he crushed that rebellion brutally, doing things that caused all kind of worries and weeping and gnashing of teeth in the West about human rights violations. But the thing about the Assads is they belong to a minority of people, the Alawites in Syria, and because they belong to a minority of people among Muslims in that area, and because the regime has been so brutal for decades, they know that if they get out of charge, if they are thrown out of power, there's going to be hell to pay for people that have been brutalized in prison and otherwise just been mistreated for generations. Now take that among the Alawites in Syria and translate that back to North Korea. The family of Kim Jong-un and the people that support him can't afford to let power go, because for decades they have been repressive, and if the day ever comes where there's a reckoning to be had for what's been going on ever since 1946, there's no way that family can afford to let power go. So keep in mind, it kind of reminds me of what Thomas Jefferson said during the 1820 Missouri crisis, when he said that America, because of the slavery issue, had a wolf by the ears. He said, we can neither hold it nor safely let it go. It's not that you don't want to let it go, you just can't do it safely. So the family business, which is tyranny, they're going to keep it in charge. They're going to do whatever they have to do to keep it in charge. And we saw early on that Kim Jong-un has all the skills he needs. He has all the desire that he needs to keep the family business running. He engineered the assassination of his own uncle. People in the West thought that was terrible. Like, we don't have relatives that we like to get rid of. but it was a very ruthless thing to do. And there's also this part right here. At the time, he was considered to be a young ruler, and he still is a young ruler, not very experienced. What I read about him is that he's privileged. He's the communist version of being a spoiled brat, privileged with no real experience, suddenly given the keys to the kingdom and not knowing what to do with them. So his inexperience and his incompetence plus fear could equal desperation and mistakes. The last thing you want is to have somebody who's afraid and incompetent with access to nuclear power. Moving right along. Second, the North Korean military. Their economy, their entire orientation toward the West and its relationship with the United States, such as it is designed as one where they are constantly under threat, constantly being the victim, constantly about to be invaded. So because there's a perpetual enemy out there over the horizon, they constantly had to be prepared for it. So that's why they give all these elaborate displays, these marches, and the fact that they're goose stepping when they march, reminding us of Nazis goose stepping, is not very encouraging either. Now, I don't know if they were inspired by the Nazis, but the fact that they're doing it is definitely troubling. Let me see something. I want to share with you all this
You need my help, Fred?
Huh?
Do you need my help?
I'm good.
Okay.
Those put one in remembrance of the Zeus, the Katyusha rocket launchers that were used by the Russians during World War II.
I need you to reshare screen if you're showing video again.
Okay. Yeah.
When you went out of PowerPoint,
Stop sharing.
So that the Zoom folks didn't see the. Are you sharing?
Stop that.
Here, watch it stop it for a minute.
Okay.
We want to share the screen. Now go play
All
the
right.
video.
Now I see.
Hold on a second, let me. Oh, it's gone. Okay, so go ahead and
Okay.
share the video.
Well, I'm actually going back to that. Can we see that?
Yep. I
Okay,
see
good.
it.
Wonderful.
Here, let's get that thing out of the way too. Oh, it'll time out.
A third reason to be concerned about North Korea is because of the relationship between North Korea and China. Xi Jinping, especially over the last year or so, has shown himself to be more of a leader who's willing to, he has been, first of all, steadily consolidating power unto himself. Second, China has become more and more aggressive toward its threats toward Taiwan. Third, the Chinese are posing more of a threat to the Philippines and the people in the Philippine archipelago. The Australians are not just somewhat nervous, they are very nervous about China's movements in East Asia. Chinese claims for their territorial waters have been pushing further and further outward from mainland China. And I guess fundamentally, they're just not as worried about the United States as they used to be. The United States has managed to shoot itself in the foot and lose a lot of its influence in a lot of areas, which is why I think President Obama and others have been looking more, or decided to look more toward projecting American force and power into East Asia, not so much Southeast Asia, although we do have a growing presence in Southeast Asia. And thank God we have a pretty good relationship with Vietnam. The last time Dr. Vanderstoep and I took students to Vietnam was in 2019, before the pandemic closed the world down and everything else, of course. One of the things about, I mean, if you can gather anything from a country just by going to its airport or an airport, we usually had to fly into Hanoi by going through Seoul Airport. And I'm telling you, in Seoul Airport, they have robots that are rolling around, selling things. I mean, it's amazing. Some robot comes up to you and says, would you like, yes. And they understand what you're saying. And as far as I'm concerned, the marker of a true advanced airport, the bathrooms are clean. So Xi Jinping is leading a nation which is definitely an economic powerhouse. But then there's this part too. North Korea, being a client of China, has also been very much involved in following the Chinese lead by investing in Africa. Now, this has been something which has completely blindsided the United States for decades. Neil Sebenya, my colleague who used to work with a lot of our off-campus study students, Neil said that at one point, the United States State Department had just one desk with a few people dedicated, or one department dedicated out of the entire State Department, one desk and a few people that are dedicated to the entire continent of Africa. Now, what has happened is that Africa has 54, possibly 55 countries. A few years ago, Sudan was divided between North Sudan and South Sudan because of the constant fighting that was going on between the Arabs in the north, Arabic Sudan in the north, and what's called Black Africa or Black Sudan in the south. If you take a look at this map, particularly in West Africa, where Mauritania and Mali are, and then moving further east and south down to Nigeria. In the area of Nigeria, particularly northern Nigeria, there's a terrorist group called Boko Haram that has been very active over the last few years. Now, Africa has been a continent where the Chinese have been investing billions of dollars, and this is not without some type of forethought or some type of a hope of a transactional, some type of transactional relationship building. It is transactional. But for a continent where countries have been perpetually, chronically underfunded or in economic distress, an outside angel coming in to do things like infrastructure, which any nation needs, bridges, roads, airports, port facilities, for things to come in to conduct trade physically. China's been on the front end of this, and so have the North Koreans. Now, not many people will know this. In Kenya, for example, from Nairobi to Mombasa, there's a thing there called the China Road, which is built with Chinese money and Chinese labor. It is one of the only, or if not the only, smooth major highway in the entire country. Kenya's roads are pretty atrocious. The only other place I can think of where roads worse than Kenya's are Michigan. So when you think about this, I mean, as just a continent that has been traditionally overlooked, not to mention the tortured history that Africa has with Western Europe and the United States in particular. And the fact that Boko Haram is a terrorist organization that's fashioning itself after ISIS, a so-called offshoot of Al-Qaeda. And if you look at the map, I mean, the map, as I tell my students all the time, will tell you a story if you let it. And the story of this map of Africa is that if you look at the Mediterranean region of this continent, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and particularly that part around Egypt that crosses right over to the West Bank and into Israel in the Middle East. That is an area where terrorism has just been so active for decades. And now this continent is seeing terrorist cells and movements across it, both from east to west, and increasingly drug cartel trafficking from South America to places like Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau a few years ago was identified as being the world's first narco state, because the drug cartels have found it easier and frankly shorter and safer to fly drugs to do their illegal activity by flying drugs from South America to Africa, and they're bringing them up across the Mediterranean to Europe, and then exporting them across the Atlantic that way. It's just a faster, safer route. So there should be, I'm hoping that somebody in the policy-making position will be concerned of terrorism and terrorists who are using very creative methods of doing their business, and they're not the same kind of terrorists that we had on September 11, 2001. Al-Qaeda is easy to understand by comparison. These splinter groups, these ISIS wannabes, these are asymmetrical warfare, and their whole idea is to inflict as much pain and punishment in the usual fashion that terrorists do. Fourth, questionable American leadership, or questions about American leadership. North Korea, during the Cold War, the first contact with American leadership was, of course, with President Harry Truman, who sent American forces into Korea soon after the invasion by the North into the South. The North Koreans have dealt with Dwight Eisenhower. The North Koreans have dealt with John F. Kennedy. The North Koreans dealt with Lyndon Johnson, who you saw in the video, said that North Korea stood as a beacon of liberty and American ingenuity, et cetera, and so on. And he wasn't wrong to say that, because North Korea had been defended by the United States. Of course, a lot of Americans lost, a lot of American men and women served to defend that country. So North Korea's success and economy is in no smart part due because of America's involvement. President Ford as well. I forgot President Nixon, sorry about that. President Carter and President Reagan was a strong supporter. Listen, all these presidents in some form or another they may not all have been on the same page completely with regard to the deployment of American forces around the world. But the thing to remember about all these presidents, particularly with regard to Dwight Eisenhower, Harry Truman served in the military in World War I. He was an artillery officer. Dwight Eisenhower, of course, was the supreme commander in Europe, supreme headquarters Allied European forces, one of the major planners for the D-Day invasion. That very famous picture of him giving that encouragement to that paratrooper on the morning of the assault before they took off. John F. Kennedy, who served in the Navy, and of course was wounded when his ship collided with a Japanese vessel. Lyndon Johnson served in the Naval Reserve. Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon served in the reserve. Jimmy Carter was a nuclear submarine officer. Ronald Reagan did his part for the military. George H.W. Bush himself was a naval fighter pilot. All these folk understood what the world was like before World War II. So for them, it made perfect sense to have forces deployed in forward areas like Berlin, in the Philippines, Guam, Korea, Iwakuni, Yokosuka, in Japan, where they are right now. Where there's been a drawdown since then, and admittedly, the world has changed. The Cold War has ended. But if you remember when President Bush gave that speech before the Congress, when he said that the Cold War has ended and peace has been restored, I remember the days immediately after that, people were talking about something called a peace dividend. All the money that we have been spending on the Cold War for building weapons. Remember, one of President Reagan's big initiatives was to essentially outspend the Soviet Union and make them build more weapons, because the belief was correct, that their economy, being a command economy, a central economy, a socialist economy, would not ever be able to keep up with the American economy. We simply spin them into non-existence, and they collapsed as a result. So I don't know how much of that theory actually directly contributed to it, but they could not keep up with us. But there was an understanding that the peace dividend, now that all that money we were spending on weapons and troops and so forth, we could bring that back and build schools and hospitals and roads, et cetera, and so on, when a new set of problems arose in the post-Cold War world. And those troops are still there needed. We still have NATO in Europe for a reason. Because we have somebody in in Russia, who is a former KGB officer, meaning from the era of the Cold War, who survived the Soviet Union, who survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, who survived the scramble for power afterward, who survived Boris Yeltsin and the rearrangement of Russia afterward. That's Vladimir Putin. This guy he's better than a cat with 9 lives. He's shrewd, he's tough, he's well-connected, he knows what he's doing, and he's absolutely ruthless and intends to stay in power. I can't think of a single person in the government that I know of right now who can match him as far as wits go. Bill Clinton dealt with North Korea. George W. Bush dealt with North Korea. Barack Obama dealt with North Korea. And usually, all these presidents, especially the last 3, 4, have been dealing with the North Korea, which likes to play this thing of brinksmanship. They'll make a threat and fire a missile to get the world's attention. Sometimes some policymakers have said that they're like little kids, little 2-year-olds. If you're not paying them enough attention, they'll fire a nuclear missile and you'll pay attention to them. Then they'll back off for a few days, and just be who they are. But President Trump also dealt with North Korea. And look, we got to give credit where it's due. Out of all those presidents, 50 years or more, he was the only one to ever visit a North Korea, actually meet with a North Korean leader, and actually had the temerity to go to North Korea. Now, there was a lot that could have happened as a result of this. A lot of policymakers and people think that we gave up a lot of political capital internationally and didn't get much for it. But the mere fact, if you believe that talking to somebody instead of fighting them is a lot better, this was progress. It showed that we could at least have a meeting with them. And there was a follow-on, a historic summit in North Korea, or rather in Singapore, between the two of them. But the fifth thing that I think is worth bringing up is something which just, frankly, is just bizarre. I'm gonna show another video, so I'm gonna get back in this. Okay. All right. Watch this. This is the reaction of the North Korean people to when Kim Jong-il died, the second leader. Not that.
성스러운 마음을 안고 우리는
Scholars of Hasp, as much as crazy as this may seem, as odd as this may look to our eyes, we will make a grave mistake to not take this seriously.
빼어 있을 것이며 장군님의 성스러운 혁명 실력과 불멸의 혁명 업적은 너무합니다. 너무합니다. 장군님 빨리 돌아오십시오.
There's one narration that says, and this I believe is the takeaway. There's one narration that says, you'll notice that everybody, of course, is doing a pretty good job of mourning the loss of the leader. But you'll also note that the camera, as the camera gets closer to people, they mourn even harder. You don't want to be seen not being utterly distraught and torn up that the great leader, the dear leader, who is said to be born on a day when snow hit the mountaintop and a ray of light came through the snow or something like that. So the takeaway I submit to you is that anytime you have a nation of people that have to perform like that for fear of reprisal, for not looking sad enough, have to prove their grief, it says something else. If they have to do that for an occasion like that, where else does the oppression penetrate? If you can be carted off or be punished for not being sad enough when the dear leader dies. We're not talking about just a repressive totalitarian society. We're talking again about a repressive totalitarian society where it's just the family business. When people carry on like that, I don't see it ending anytime soon. So we should not take their grieving and the performance lightly. And it's nothing more than just a very, very narrow insight into a nation that is nuclear capable and has, as we ask the question, where do we go from here? This map right here shows us, it's not one of the best ones, but it shows the range of North Korean ballistic missiles. Do you see the outer circle that begins to approach Denver, San Francisco, and Los Angeles? And then you'll notice that the rings also include Australia, Okinawa, Japan. Okinawa, the 3rd Marine Division, is located in Japan right now. We have Air Force bases in Iwakuni and Yokosuka in Japan. We have forces on station in South Korea. Now, look, I get that for many people, they want the world to pay their fair share, and it's not fair that the American taxpayer has to carry the load for defending other people who may have rich governments and rich societies and are prospering, doing very well. And it could be just the school that I came up in, the school of thought that I came up in. The people who taught me about foreign policy, both in grad school and in undergrad, said that when you are a superpower, being a superpower comes with responsibilities. And every survey that I've ever seen, every survey that I've ever heard has indicated that people around the world may not like the United States, they may not trust us, they may not like a single thing we do, but when asked, would they rather see America off the world stage or China or Russia, we always come up to the top. For all that we may do wrong, we are still the better choice in the other two. Because Americans may stumble as we lean forward, but we'll at least lean forward, stumbling notwithstanding. And like Maya Angelou said, no, when somebody shows you who they are, believe them. We've seen who they are. We need to believe who they say they are. They're a totalitarian dictatorship with nuclear weapons and a perpetual state of fear and looking for a reason to use them. And the mere fact that they fire weapons across the 38th parallel every now and then at their South Korean neighbors should give us some real clear ideas or proof that they're willing to follow through on what they're threatening. And again, I've seen pictures of the tunnels, which are big enough for tractor trailers to drive through. And sometimes they close them up. Sometimes they're concreted up. Sometimes they're blown up, but they're there. They're never stopped looking for a weak point. This is a picture of North Korea at night. A nation with nuclear weapons that doesn't have the infrastructure to keep its lights on, you should know it's a repressive regime. It's literally in the dark. This shows some of our deployments in Alaska, Japan, Okinawa, Guam. Diego Garcia, during the video, when they were talking with the one gentleman, with all due respect to his military service and 4 times being in combat, no, there's a reason why we have Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia is a forward deployment base that's there. And of course, what happened to Diego Garcia with getting the inhabitants off the island or taking over the island from the inhabitants was a terrible, tragic thing when it comes to human relations, and we should have done a better job of that. But we have that base as a forward deployment base in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, because the Indian Ocean just happens to be that area where it's close enough to Australia, but it's also close enough to where if we have to deploy to the Middle East, instead of carrying all the stuff that we need with us, you can stop at Diego Garcia and get what they call pre-positioned materials and go on to your forward area. In 1990, 1991, when we fought, well, first it was Operation Desert Shield. The first thing we had to do was establish a forward base in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and build up. And once we got enough troops and supplies there, then the attack could begin to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, Operation Desert Shield. Now, with the way things are today, as far as my observations of things, with asymmetrical warfare being what it is, it's true that the United States is one of those rare nations in history that has the land lift, airlift, and land lift, sea lift, and airlift capability. We actually don't need anybody's help to get anywhere around the world. We can do it on our own, like he said. So that part is true. The question is, do you want to do it on your own? Just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you should do a thing. So it's good that we have the capability, but collective security has been a reality in global politics, at least since Waterloo in 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Frankly, since 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, where nations figured out, like Article 5 with NATO, that an attack on one is considered an attack upon all. It's not to necessarily share the burden, it's to make sure that the peace can be maintained so that any would-be aggressor understands that attacking one would be to have more people to fight. In other words, making it too expensive for there to be war, therefore peace is maintained. You'll notice that South Korea in blue, Japan in blue, Alaska. There's so much that goes into thinking about this kind of stuff, not just, I mean, even with the design of an aircraft like the C-17 transport plane, they have the ability to fly thousands of miles and be able to have in-flight refueling and so forth, so that they literally don't have to land to continue on to where they're going. The way they fly to make sure they have a tailwind to cut down on fuel consumption and to get there faster. There's all these things that go into planning a land lift, sea lift, or airlift operation. You saw the video on South Korea. These are some considerations about North Korea, the two Koreas. Thanks for letting me share some ideas with you. We'll have a discussion now. Yes.
As you saw, we have a lot of people that are tuning in remotely. They cannot hear me. So as you ask questions, try to need to repeat them.
Sure.
So that the remote viewers can hear that discussion as well.
This one, yeah, so The Zoom screen's up. Go ahead.
Okay. Hello, scholars of HASP. Hello, Zoom scholars of HASP. Good to see you.
On Zoom, Donna Stockton has her hand raised. Donna, if you'd like to unmute, go ahead and ask your question.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. I did read a book and I wondered your opinion on The Girl with Seven Names. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. It's an extraordinary insight into life under one of the world's communist countries, story of one woman's life. And it's a very good read if you haven't read it.
I am not familiar with the book, sorry.
It's called The Girl with Seven Names by Lee.
What country does it focus on? Does it focus on
Korea.
North Korea?
Yes, North
Okay.
Korea. It's her life getting out of it, trying to get her family out. And it's a very good story of life there. Thank you.
And that's the amazing, thank you for the question. That's another amazing thing about North Korea. There are people that actually defect and escape, which is pretty incredible. Now you can just imagine that given that kind of regime, if they catch you, well, it's just going to be bad for you and your family all the way around. But there actually are people in South Korea who escaped North Korea. Oftentimes they had to do so by going through China. So apparently there is a very active human smuggling ring that operates through China. And the Chinese authorities are no less happy about this kind of thing than the North Korean authorities are as well. And I got to tell you that I think it was in 2017 when we took the students to the Vietnamese-Chinese border, we were told that the Hmong women the Hmong village we were, that the Hmong women are very much worried about Chinese border guards because of China's one-child policy for decades there, and because China preferred to have boys being born than girls, they now have a woman shortage. So they're literally crossing into Vietnam and kidnapping women to take them back to China to be wives. So there's all kinds of strange things happening around the world, just as an adjunct to other things happening in China. Yes.
You talk a lot about the military capabilities of North Korea. What I've heard, appreciate the correcting me, is that the economic situation of North Korea is rather perilous. It's not a wealthy country. It's not developing. It weren't China's explicit support. Probably bankrupt. China is now experiencing severely reduced growth rates and is facing, as you pointed out, its own demographic crisis. Is it possible that economics will undo the North Koreans?
The question is that the statement is that the North Koreans are economically lackluster society, and they are, and that economic difficulty is possibly having an impact on their military capability, but their supporter, China, is also going through some economic difficulties, and those two combined, what's the likely result? Will that have any kind of a negative effect on the North Korean posture and policy? Does that pretty much sum it up? Looking at the history of regimes like that, and just going back to the Soviet Union was also an economically poorly performing country as well. But the interests of the Communist Party superseded the needs of the people. In other words, the communists were more interested in hanging on to power and were absolutely prepared to let the people suffer economically as long as they could maintain power. Likewise, I have seen nothing in the three leaders of North Korea that suggests to me that they will somehow become more focused upon their population, which is already a big homeless population, and there are people who are starving in North Korea. They'll never tell you that, but they're not supposed to tell you that. So the economy could continue, but what they will do is they will continue taking whatever they're getting from the Chinese and diverting it toward supporting their military, as opposed to taking care of the needs of the people. So there's a great, I was reading something where they're deathly afraid of the fact that if in fact the economy does collapse, you're looking at, and the reason why the Chinese again don't want things to collapse in North Korea is because if in fact North Korea collapses, then you're looking at a human migration problem that's going to be impacting the Chinese directly that they're not prepared to handle. Do you think we have people at the Southern American border that causes us problems? They estimate 2 million people walking across the border into China. China, as big as it is, just can't absorb all that, at least not like that. So it's in their interest to keep North Korea afloat, and that means keeping that regime afloat. As long as that regime is afloat, the North Korean people will continue to suffer.
I have a couple new ones in the chat, Fred. The first is what do you think would have happened if MacArthur would have been allowed to try to drive the communists out of Korea?
You know, I have a friend back in Maryland who always says, we just let MacArthur go in there and do what he's going to do. I said, that only works if you don't have the Soviet Union. You need to understand that by 1950, America had lost its nuclear monopoly. And here's the caveat. The caveat is this: even though the Russians had exploded their first atomic device in 1949, okay, it still might have been difficult for them to get to us because a nuclear device is only valuable to you in a war if you can get it to the target. I don't think they had the means to deliver it. So there's the delivery capability. In other words, the aerial platform, missile, airplane, or otherwise. And I'm not so sure that the Russians had an airplane like the B-29 that had the lift capability, because an atomic bomb, as it turns out, is bigger than your regular bomb, at least back in that day and time. So you needed something big and powerful like a B-29 to get it over target. But when you lose your nuclear monopoly like that, MacArthur notwithstanding, you simply could not afford. And more than that, I think it was Omar Nelson Bradley, who at that time had moved to become part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is quoted as having said that an expanded land war in Asia, or any kind of land war in Asia, was the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. That proved to be true in Korea, and absolutely true to be true in Vietnam. Expanding it to China would have been completely insane. And at the same time, we need to keep in mind the attitude and mindset and emotions of the American people during the time of the Korean War. Many of you have probably read The Bridges at Tokyo by James Michener. That book, it's a wonderful book, only about that thick, but it's essentially an anti-war book, where James Michener is talking about, listen, you have the generation of World War II that did their part. They wouldn't fought the Nazis. They fought the Japanese militarists. They fought the fascists, the Italian fascists. They did their part. They put everything on the line, came back. It's supposed to be somebody else's job right now. The other part was, how do you do that? The reluctance, the situation in Korea was not as clear cut as it was in World War II. The Japanese hitting Pearl Harbor, that's pretty much cut and dry. You only have one response if you're a chief executive of the United States. But when it's a limited war, we have the communists who have such a huge part of the world's landmass, and there's no doubt that the Russians and the Chinese are backing the North Koreans. You're asking for another global war, and the American people, the West, just either wouldn't have been prepared for that, or we're not about to do that. That's why they called it limited war. That's why it was so difficult to figure out, how do you fight a limited war, given the way Americans have been taught to fight a war since 1862, when Solomon Bolivar Buckner sent that message to Ulysses S. Grant saying, give me your terms and conditions of surrender. And Grant sent another message back, what's the matter with you? You're surrounded. There are no terms and conditions. Surrender unconditionally. That's how we had fought wars. But now we can't do that anymore. The days of America throwing its weight around were over with by 1950.
Okay.
Yes.
When our daughter was 26, born in Korea, we visited Korea, and a couple things about it. One is, it felt to us like it was very Western and very Korean all at the same time. And when I came home, well, do you feel more Korean or less Korean or more American? Well, I feel more Korean in the way I look and more American in everything else.
Well, wait, did she feel more Korean the way she looked over there, or when she came back here?
Oh, she came to us when she was 8 months old. She'd never been to Korea before until she was 26.
Okay, but what I'm asking is, so you guys took her to Korea, right? She went to Korea. And then she said she felt more Korean, but did she feel more Korean in the US or in?
More Korean the way she looked and more American and everything else.
Okay. Okay. I can see that. That's logical.
I have a couple more in the chat.
Yes.
Next one is, since North Korea is run as a family business, should we just pull back from an aggressive worry as the day has passed when we could challenge the family for power?
No, I've never been squeamish about using American power. And I, Kim, it could just be, it could just be a function of my historical training, but I don't think, I still don't believe that you get any kind of mileage by appeasing dictators. Dictators are nothing more than international bullies. And just like on the schoolyard, bullies simply don't know to leave you alone until you tell them that you make them understand that they're going to pay a price for their bullying. So it would be nice if we could go ahead and remove these dictators. That would be my preference, but people have to do that on their own. But at the same time, if they're going to be bullies, we can find them and they're bullying to within their own borders.
Next one is, in as much as you can foresee the future, what might we expect to see as reset after COVID?
A reset after COVID. Wow, that's I think that what will happen is that there have been so many things that have changed domestically. I mean, look at how we're having this session, right? This is hybrid. So there's been so many things that have changed fundamentally around the world. And one of the things that we're going to have to deal with early on, Kim, is the fact that, right now, an immediate concern is the supply chain. We have so much of our manufacturing offshore in Korea, in Vietnam, the Philippines, in China especially. The trade relations that have been strained because of that, the economic relations that have been strained because of that, there may be some talks about that kind of thing that may have some political implications as well. I must tell you all, relative to the question about whether or not Korea is more westernized and so on, I was absolutely disappointed when I got to Vietnam the first time in 2017. I said, wow, in Hanoi, in the Vietnam, and what did I see? Golden arches from McDonald's. I said, you kidding me? What's the next question? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for this class. One of the things I heard this morning on the way in here, NPR's Marketplace, that kind of plugs into what you have been commenting on and teaching us, is that they're talking about how the post-COVID infection has dealt an economic blow to China. And right now with their market woes, especially in the real estate market, which is tending towards collapse, and other market issues, kind of like our supply side chain reaction issues, how this is going to affect countries like dealing with the Chinese and the North Koreans and all the other countries around China. It gives us something to think and ponder. Thank you.
Sure. And for those who would see the difficulties in the Chinese economy as being a good thing for America, I will remind them that the Chinese have a lot of our debt, that they're servicing a lot of our debt. So whatever bad happens to them is going to inevitably involve us. We need to also remember too, that it's these kind of invisible connections, or sometimes not so invisible connections. Pre-1929, the Germans can't pay their debts to the French and the British can't pay their debts to us. And then they say, we're not going to pay anymore. They can't do it. What are you going to do to us? What, make us fight a world war and beat us? And when that happened, the cascade began, right? The dominoes began to fall. So these connections and the fact that we have been so frivolous in our national budgeting and moving things offshore for decades now is an indicator that we have some things to be very concerned with. I was telling the students just a few days ago that some of the things that we put in place after the Great Depression, like the Glass-Steagall Act, where commercial and investment banks were separated by law. And then I think in 1993, Bill Clinton did away with that. and then Travelers Group Insurance and Citibank merged together to become Citigroup. Then in 2008, they were called what? Too big to fail. To let one go down the tube, we drag everybody else with them. We're kind of like in that situation now. China is frankly too big to fail. We can't afford for it to fail. So if we're gonna have somebody service our debt, we need to find a poor country to do it, or find some way of cooperating with them. Okay, you all, it's 10:58 or 11 o'clock.
So no, the clock's saying 11 o'clock, so we are out of time. So thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I just
really appreciate that. Really appreciate you. Thank you all for being here.
Can I just say it is so good seeing you all. I have missed you. It is good seeing you. Thank you for coming out.
Well done.
Thanks, everybody.
Well done. Great job. By the way,